Friends, it just exploded. Giorgia Meloni, the woman who handed Ursula von der Leyen the votes she needed to survive her second term, has just stood up in front of Europe and called her a tyrant, not privately, not through diplomatic back channels, publicly on the record, with documents in hand. The deal that was supposed to hold the European Union together has been incinerated. And what Meloni found buried inside Brussels' next budget, a €2 trillion blueprint that was never meant to be read by anyone outside the Parlement, is so explosive, so deliberately hidden, and so structurally designed to strip every European nation of its financial independence forever that the Commission is now in full emergency containment mode. This is not a policy disagreement between two leaders with different visions for Europe. This is a declaration of total war. And the weapon Meloni is holding is not a speech or a press statement. It is evidence. Specific, documented, line-by-line evidence of what Brussels was quietly planning to do with your money while your government smiled and told you everything was fine. The mask has come off. And what is underneath it will change everything you thought you understood about who actually controls Europe. Meloni just brutally accuses von der Leyen what Brussels was planning to do with your money. Hook, friends, it just exploded. Giorgia Meloni, the woman who handed Ursula von der Leyen the votes she needed to survive her second term, has just stood up in front of Europe and called her a tyrant, not privately, not through diplomatic back channels, publicly on the record with documents in hand. The deal that was supposed to hold the European Union together has been incinerated. And what Meloni found buried inside Brussels' next budget, a €2 trillion blueprint that was never meant to be read by anyone outside the Parlement, is so explosive, so deliberately hidden, and so structurally designed to strip every European nation of its financial independence forever that the Commission is now in full emergency containment mode. This is not a policy disagreement between two leaders with different visions for Europe. This is a declaration of total war. And the weapon Meloni is holding is not a speech or a press statement. It is evidence. Specific, documented, line-by-line evidence of what Brussels was quietly planning to do with your money while your government smiled and told you everything was fine. The mask has come off, and what is underneath it will change everything you thought you understood about who actually controls Europe. Section 1. To understand the full scale of what Meloni just triggered, you cannot start with this week. You have to start with a room, a deal, and a promise that Brussels never intended to keep. 12 months ago, Giorgia Meloni was the most powerful kingmaker in European politics. When Ursula von der Leyen needed votes to secure her second term as president of the European Commission, she needed Italy. She needed Meloni's political bloc, her parliamentary influence, and the cover that Rome's support would provide against accusations that her second mandate was being imposed rather than earned. Behind closed doors, the understanding between Rome and Brussels was specific and transactional. Italy would deliver the political support von der Leyen needed to survive. In return, Brussels would respect Italian sovereignty on key policy areas, protect European agricultural communities from the most damaging effects of incoming trade agreements, and keep the Commission's federalist ambitions within limits that national governments could accept. It was the kind of arrangement that has always kept the European Union functioning, quiet, bilateral, and built entirely on the assumption that both sides would honor what was agreed. That assumption just died, and Meloni is the one who killed it, deliberately, publicly, and with surgical precision that suggests this moment was not a reaction. It was a plan. The first fracture did not appear in a parliamentary chamber or a legal filing. It appeared in a field. In the final weeks of winter 2026, thousands of European farmers began blocking roads across the continent with tractors, from the agricultural plains of Lombardy to the outskirts of Paris, from the flatlands of Bavaria to the rural heartland of the Netherlands. Generational farming families whose ancestors had worked the same land for centuries found themselves staring at the imminent destruction of their livelihoods. Their anger had a single, specific target: the Mercosur trade agreement, a sweeping deal between the European Union and the South American trading bloc that would open European markets to a flood of cheap beef, soy, and agricultural products produced under environmental and labor standards that European farmers are legally prohibited from matching. It was not a competitive market. It was a structured elimination. And while the tractors were blocking the streets and the fury was reaching a temperature that European governments could not ignore, von der Leyen did not pause, did not reconsider, and did not engage with the democratic objections being raised inside the European Parliament with mounting urgency. She accelerated. She invoked provisional application clauses to push the deal's implementation forward before any organized political resistance could consolidate. She bypassed agricultural committee resolutions. She dismissed emergency debates. She moved with the kind of institutional confidence that comes from believing that the opposition cannot stop you regardless of how loud it gets. For Meloni, this was not a policy error she could attribute to miscalculation or poor political judgment. This was contempt. Her inner circle began using a specific phrase internally to describe what von der Leyen had just done to European farming communities. They called it the Great Agricultural Sellout, a deliberate sacrifice of Italian and European farmers on the altar of German automotive export interests and the demands of globalist financial networks who stood to extract enormous profit from cheaper South American supply chains flooding into European distribution systems. But what transformed a serious policy confrontation into an existential declaration of war was what Meloni's economic team discovered when they stopped looking at the Mercosur deal in isolation and started reading the next document on Brussels' agenda. The 2028 to 2034 multi-annual financial framework, 2 trillion euros, the largest single budget in the history of the European Union. And buried inside its thousands of pages of dense bureaucratic language was something that crossed every red line Rome had ever publicly drawn, and several it had never needed to draw before, because no one had ever been bold enough to propose what von der Leyen's budget team had quietly drafted. The mechanism was labeled internally as the Centralized Competitiveness Fund. On the surface, framed in the careful language that Brussels uses to make structural power grabs sound like administrative efficiency measures, it was presented as a modernized approach to distributing cohesion funds, the billions of euros allocated annually to regional development across member states. Underneath that framing was a transfer of financial sovereignty so radical, so total, and so deliberately obscured in technical language that Meloni's economists described their reaction upon reading the full governance architecture as genuinely disbelieving. Under the proposed model, national governments would lose direct control over how their regional development allocations were spent. Rome would no longer decide where southern Italian infrastructure investment went. Warsaw would no longer determine which Polish industrial regions received development funding. Those decisions would transfer to a committee of unelected commission technocrats operating out of Brussels, distributing funds according to a performance-based compliance system that tied funding levels directly to ideological alignment with commission positions. And here is where the architecture of control reveals its true character. The compliance metrics being proposed were not economic benchmarks. They were political ones. Adherence to Commission migration policy frameworks, alignment with gender policy directives set not by national parliaments, but by Brussels administrators. Carbon transition timelines determined not through democratic deliberation inside member states, but through technocratic scheduling inside the Parlement. The message embedded in the structure was not subtle. Comply with the ideological agenda of the Commission, or watch your regional funding disappear. Govern your country the way Brussels approves or accept financial punishment administered by people your citizens never elected and cannot remove. Meloni reviewed the leaked draft provisions personally. Her response, relayed to her cabinet in terms that left no room for diplomatic interpretation, was unambiguous. What she was looking at was not a budget framework. It was a financial dictatorship, dressed in the language of European solidarity. And she was not going to allow it to pass without a confrontation that Brussels would not be able to manage, minimize, or negotiate away through the selective deal-making that had defused every previous sovereignty challenge the Commission had faced. The timing of her decision to go public collided with something that had never fully disappeared from European political consciousness: the Pfizer-Gate scandal. Those missing text messages between von der Leyen and the CEO of Pfizer. Communications that EU courts had already ruled must be disclosed and which the Commission had continued to obstruct through procedural delays and legal challenges had remained a slow-burning credibility wound throughout von der Leyen's second term. In March 2026, new legal challenges filed in the EU's highest courts began explicitly connecting the institutional culture of opacity that produced the missing vaccine procurement messages to the deliberate obscurity surrounding the new budget framework's governance architecture. Meloni seized on that connection immediately and with devastating rhetorical precision. She began asking publicly the question that von der Leyen's communications team had no prepared answer for. How can the people of Europe be expected to hand 2 trillion euros of their collective future to a president who still cannot account for a handful of text messages from her recent past? It was a simple line. It was an unanswerable line. And it reframed the entire budget confrontation from a technical policy dispute into a fundamental question about democratic accountability and institutional trustworthiness that struck directly at the most vulnerable point in von der Leyen's political armor. By the second week of March 2026, the atmosphere inside EU institutions had reached a temperature that veteran Brussels observers described as unlike anything they had witnessed in the modern history of the Commission. Emergency sessions running back to back. Von der Leyen's communications operation working around the clock to frame Meloni's objections as populist posturing disconnected from economic reality. But the framing was failing because Meloni was not arguing in abstractions. She was arguing in numbers, specific, documented, publicly verifiable numbers that the Commission had buried inside a 2,000-page document and prayed that nobody outside their own budget directorate would ever isolate and present to a general audience. 131 billion euros earmarked for a centralized defense fund that would give Brussels unprecedented command authority over military spending without requiring ratification from a single national parliament. 6.3 billion euros allocated as the total agricultural safety net for the entire continent, a figure so grotesquely disproportionate to the damage being inflicted by Mercosur that even commentators broadly sympathetic to the Commission's agenda struggled to defend it publicly without embarrassment. 35% of total budget expenditure locked into green transition projects operating on timelines that independent economists were describing as structurally incompatible with maintaining European industrial competitiveness against Chinese and American manufacturing pressure. Each number released sequentially by Meloni's communications operation with the precision of a coordinated campaign rather than the randomness of genuine outrage landed in the European press like a specifically calibrated detonation, giving journalists a concrete data point, forcing the Commission to respond to specifics it could not simply dismiss as ideology. Building a cumulative picture of institutional priorities so skewed against ordinary European citizens that the political damage compounded with every release. And then Meloni's team found something else, something buried so deep inside the leaked budget drafts that it had not surfaced in any of the public reporting. Something that was not a policy mechanism or a funding allocation or a governance architecture, something personal, something specific, something that von der Leyen's office had been working frantically to keep contained before the European Council summit scheduled for March 19th. Because if what Meloni's team had found became public before that summit, it would not just weaken von der Leyen's negotiating position. It would not just generate another damaging news cycle for the Commission. It would end her presidency entirely. So what exactly did Meloni find? And why is Brussels willing to sacrifice everything, every alliance, every negotiation, every remaining shred of institutional credibility to keep it buried just a few days longer? Section 2. The document that Meloni's team pulled from the leaked budget drafts was not supposed to exist in the form they found it. It had been fragmented across 17 separate annexes written in 4 different bureaucratic registers and cross-referenced through a system of internal commission codes that were designed to be meaningless to anyone reading a single section in isolation. It was the kind of deliberate architectural obscurity that takes expertise to construct and patience to dismantle. Meloni's economists spent 72 hours reassembling the fragments, and when the full picture emerged from the pieces, the reaction inside Rome's inner circle was described by those present as a moment of absolute stillness, the kind that precedes not panic, but calculation.